left corner there. And we are joined by a special guest this evening, Ryan Wilson from CBS Sports. Ryan, how are you? And thank you so much for joining us.
Matt, Ryan, I am doing great. NFL draft is right around the corner. It feels like it will never get here for a variety of reasons, mostly because I do countless mock drafts and I feel like I'm a Groundhog Day. But I'm glad to be here, man. I'm glad to talk some football and talk about the Buffalo Bills.
That's a great point. Like, what is this time of year for you? I feel like it's like for somebody that covers the draft 365, what is this week? We're going to get to a point where flip page real quick. Obviously, with Corona, it's a little bit different right now. But what is this week traditionally like for you?
This stretch has actually been crazy bonkers. And I've actually said this to people. My work is getting in the way of my work. So I do a lot of CBS Sports HQ, which is our 24/7 streaming sports network online at, CBS Sports HQ.com. So I do a lot of that, which I enjoy doing. Of course, I do some writing, mostly mock drafts with some other stuff. And after the combine, I don't have a lot of time to myself. Like, I don't have time necessarily carved out in my day to watch some players that I'm interested in watching. I have to find time to do that, maybe late at night or early in the morning. Whereas from May until January, I have that time available. And it's sort of, I figured out after doing this for a few years now, I have to sort of have most of the guys done that I want to watch. And I try to watch close to 300 guys, have to have most of those guys done by the Senior Bowl, and then pick and choose to rewatch some guys or maybe catch up on some sort of late in the process sleepers, if you will. So yeah, it's crazy right now. Between talking to you guys, and I'll do radio, and then I'll do video, and I'll do writing, but it's a good crazy. And I mean, don't get the impression that I'm complaining. I actually love my job, which is, incredibly fortunate to have this job, and I like doing it. But it's just sort of funny that I want to be able to watch some more players right now and maybe do a little more research on the guys that I like, but it's incredibly hard to find that time to do it.
So I have this at the top of our show rundown today because I got a confession to make here. I've probably done maybe 10 times as many mock drafts as I ever done in my life the last 2 months. And I have to sit here and think, you put out 2 in the last week. So how many mock drafts do you do from the course of when you put out your first till draft night?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Matt, because I do one literally every week, starting with the beginning of college football. So I'm on mock draft 32. Mock draft 33 will come out next Monday. In the last month or so, I've done 3-round mock drafts just to spice it up a little bit. And last week, and you've talked about this before, I did a 7-round mock draft, and I do not recommend a 7-round mock draft for anyone unless you are being punished for something you've done. It is oh my gosh, it's a ton of work. And the thing is, and you know this, and mock drafts are basically a drug. You know that nothing is going to be what you think it's going to be right now on draft night in the first round, let alone round 6. But you can't not look at it, and that's part of the appeal. You try to figure out what teams are thinking, what teams will do. The trading scenarios are bonkers. I do that occasionally, but not very often, just because at the end of the day, you have no idea. You can get a little overboard with it. You can, try to manufacture trades that include players currently on contract, like Odell Beckham, for example. And then how far down that road do you want to go? But the long answer is I've done 32 of these things. I have 2 more to go. I'm going to do 2 next week because why not? And then you might think I'll be done. I will not be done. The following Monday, I'll have the 2021 mock draft coming out. And then I'm taking a week off. I'm not even kidding.
Now, Ryan, with free agency, how much does that change your process? So, for instance, I did a mock draft where I had a cornerback for the Bills in round 2, and then probably an hour after that, they signed E.J. Gaines. They'd already had Josh Norman, and it kind of felt like, well, throw that one out. So, on a week-by-week basis, when you're making these, how much does free agency kind of play a role into that in terms of, okay, I have to go back and look at what all 32 teams did, even if it's a 1-round mock draft?
Yeah, it's funny, Ryan. You sort of go through the process during the fall where you're moving NFL teams up and down the draft order based on whether they're winning or losing that week. So by December 31st, end of the season, the NFL season, you're glad just to have those teams set. So then from December 31st until free agency, you're actually bored because you're doing the exact same teams in the exact same order, virtually filling the pretty much the same needs. So I have never been more excited this spring perhaps than when free agency began. So I can see, okay, the teams are filling this need. These teams are filling these needs. I can go back and recalibrate the mock draft and have something different to talk about because, as we've sort of established, I'm doing this literally every 7 days. And so the free agency was a welcome sort of off-season Christmas for me. And it certainly changed the way you do your mock drafts. But something noteworthy, the Jets, for example, who are in the AFC East, obviously, they signed a couple of offensive linemen in free agency. One of them being George Fant, who isn't very good. And I think that's no big secret. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Jets won't take an offensive tackle should he be there at number 11. I mean, conventional wisdom, and it's fun to say, okay, they'll take CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy or maybe even Henry Ruggs at 11 because Sam Darnold needs that help. But if Andrew Thomas is there or Tristan Wirfs is there, Mekhi Becton maybe, they may still take an offensive tackle because at the end of the day, Sam Darnold getting hit 50 times isn't such a great proposition if he's your franchise quarterback for anything more than a few years.
And you mentioned the draft mock draft for next year right after this one is over, and that brings up an interesting point when you're talking about the Jets, particularly if they do go offensive line with their first round pick this year. That next year's wide receiver class, where it may not be as deep as this year, from what I'm aware of, there are some potential home run hitters in that draft that they might be able to turn around and get that next year.
Yeah, deep dive. That's right. So Jamar Chase, of course, at LSU, he'll be near the top. There's Rashad Bateman out of Minnesota, who's going to be really good. There's let's see, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's Equanimeous Brown. He plays at Equanimeous Brown's brother. He plays at USC. Those are 3 guys off the top of my head who have a chance to be really good. If they have good seasons next year, they'll be in the first round conversation, at least starting in the summer. We'll see what pans out. But to your point, Matt, this offensive line class is pretty deep. But the top 4 guys, I think, have separated themselves from the rest of the class at offensive tackle. And if the Jets feel like they need to get one of these guys early, and with that the wide receiver class being even deeper, and they can circle back and get a wide receiver later, that may be the direction they choose to go. Even though they've signed a couple of offensive tackles and offensive interior guys in free agency.
What do you make of all of these mock draft machines? And do you have any that you use as a professional mock drafter, if you will? Because I've spent the last couple of weeks in quarantine here trying out a bunch of them. Obviously, the Draft Network has one that's pretty widely used. I did one. It was called firstpick.com, where you can actually do trades, and trades get offered to you, which I thought was a cool, like Madden-like feature. But for you, a person that's doing mock drafts all the time, do you use any of these?
I do, and I love them. I do them solely for pleasure, like just to see what I can do. I'm a Steelers fan, full disclosure, and they don't have a ton of picks this year, so I'll run through real quick. I'll use the Pro Football Network one because it's pretty fast, and go through the Steelers picks in 3 or 4 minutes just to see what I can do. I don't know if their rankings of players is necessarily super accurate as the NFL might feel it is. But hey, the upside is the Steelers get a steal in every single round, so I'm okay with that. But in terms of like when I do a 7-round mock or even when I do a 3-round mock, I'll use the draftnetwork.com's mock draft machine because it's a little more in depth. It provides a few more bells and whistles, if you will. And I don't use it to pick the players. I use it to make sure I know who's available and who isn't available. So, because there's nothing worse, by the way, than doing a mock draft and having the same player go twice.
Mm-hmm.
Because Twitter will let you know quickly that you're a moron because you twice for 2 different teams. Hey, man, I've been up 12 hours. Give me a break. So I like to use the Draft Network because it'll let me know who's been selected, where they've been selected, and I don't have to worry about double picking a guy. So that's primarily what I use it for. But it's a great resource in terms of all the work those guys do there. But their mock draft machine is probably the best. I know PFF came out with one recently. I've looked at that a little bit. But I think in terms of front end user experience, I think the Draft Network has a foothold on having the best one now. But that will probably change as these things get more and more sort of, what's the word, precise in terms of what users want to do.
So as we transition, I wanted to talk a little bit, of just draft week and mock drafts and everything like that. But let's transition a little bit to what we're going to dive into here in this 2020 draft. And specifically from a Bills perspective, I wanted to get your thoughts. You went and saw the Bills one time in person this year. We were talking a little bit before the show started. You saw them play the Patriots. And, as somebody that lives in central New York, familiar with what's been going on and the way this roster's been rebuilt. So if you look at the Bills and Josh Allen from a 30,000 foot vantage point over the last 3 years since Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott have gotten here, where are you sitting right now on how bullish are you on this team, this quarterback going into 2020 and the immediate future, the next couple of years?
I love Sean. For full disclosure, I went to college with Sean McDermott, so I've known him from a distance for a long time. I talked to him at the Panthers Broncos Super Bowl, so I think that was January 2016 when he was the D coordinator for the Panthers. We talked for a long time, mostly about college. And I saw him recently at the combine. And he was a little busy. He didn't have much time to talk. That's okay. He's got a job to do. But I love the job he and Brandon Beane have done. I love the roster. I love the way this defense plays for Sean McDermott. I love that the offense is improving. And they have playmakers outside, and Cole Beasley and John Brown. They got Stephon Diggs, which I think is a great get. I love Dawson Knox last year coming out of the draft. He played at Ole Miss in a sort of a weird system. Obviously, everyone knows that A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf were there. So Dawson Knox didn't get used a lot. But we saw glimpses last year of his potential. I think the offensive line has a chance to be good, and it continues to improve. I love Devin Singletary. Last year, I don't remember where exactly I had him ranked, but I liked him a lot more than Darrell Henderson, who ended up going in the third round to the Rams. I didn't get the love for Darrell Henderson coming out, but I loved what Devin Singletary was doing in college, and we saw glimpses of that last year. Is he a 3-down back? That's another question, and I'm assuming Frank Gore won't play forever, so I don't think he's coming back. Mm-hmm. But if you got Devin Singletary some help, I think that he would appreciate it, and everyone else would too. So Josh Allen, he's had his ups and downs. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. He struggled as a rookie, I feel like. I think he got a lot better last year. And we saw glimpses of him being really good. And then we saw some of the things we saw in the previous year that left us shaking our head. But I think he's going to continue to get better. And here's the thing, like there's some similarities between him and Justin Herbert in terms of their physical skills and their arm strength and the questions about what they did in college and would that translate. Josh Allen will probably never be the most accurate quarterback in the NFL, but he has shown that he's going to get better, and he's done that. And I think unlike Justin Herbert, and the first thing Justin Herbert said to me when I talked to him at the Senior Bowl, I asked the typical question, what are NFL teams wanting to see from me this week? He didn't mention anything about 3-step drops or getting the ball out quickly or throwing this pattern better than this pattern. The only thing he talked about was I need to show them that I can be a better leader. And I think Justin Herbert's a great kid, and you can't say enough good things about the person that he is. But the fact that all these teams have questions about his ability to lead is an interesting one, and I don't think that's something that anyone's ever said about Josh Allen. And he's a fiery guy, and you don't see it because he's sort of aw shucks when he's talking to the media, but he gets after it.
Not when he's talking to Barstool, Ryan. When
right.
Barstool gets him, he's a little bit more loosey-goosey. He'll talk about the shorts, shotgun a beer. But yeah, with us, you're right.
Yeah, Barstool, those guys are secretly really good interviewers, and hats off to them. But I think that people sell Josh Allen short on that aspect of his game. And if your teammates believe in you, that goes a long way. And I think next year or the 2020 season, you get a running back and maybe a little more offensive line help. And I think Josh Allen has a chance to take that next step. And look, I'm on the Bills bandwagon to win the division. I liked them a lot last year. The only issue I've ever had with Sean McDermott in Buffalo is the whole Nathan Peterman. I didn't get that at all. Yeah. And you could talk to me for the next 100 years, and I wouldn't understand what that was all about. I can understand not loving Tyrod. I mean, he's extremely boring as a quarterback. I understand that. And Josh Allen is probably a 180, and that's not a bad thing. But everything else that Beane and McDermott have done, it's hard to argue with, especially on the – look, man, they went to Pittsburgh, and they whooped up on the Steelers. And you can say Duck Hodges or Mason, whoever was starting the game, was the quarterback. That doesn't matter. In a typical Buffalo Bills versus Pittsburgh Steelers game in Pittsburgh, the Bills probably aren't winning that game. That I thought was not a turning point because they were playing well up to that point, but it put a big win for them. And I'm sure something Sean McDermott told them they could do well in advance, and he proved that they proved together they could do it. And I expect that to spill over into next season.
No, Ryan, you mentioned Josh Allen and his accuracy. That's something that a lot of people bring up. One thing we've seen over the last few years is the philosophy of Brendan Bean and kind of changed in terms of the types of wide receivers that he wanted to get Josh Allen. First year, it was Kelvin Benjamin, who, not even in the league anymore. All of a sudden, he's gone to these guys that can create separation because they're great route runners. You have John Brown, you have Cole Beasley, now you have Stephon Diggs. How important do you think it is for that change in philosophy, and how important do you think that is in terms of helping Josh Allen take that next step, even in 2020?
I mean, that's a great point, Ryan. Kelvin Benjamin is a tight end, and he might be closer to right tackle. When he was there, he wasn't getting open, and he had a huge year as a rookie, I believe, in Carolina. But then I think he tore his ACL, and then never really sort of picked back up for him. I think Kelvin Benjamin is a tough target for just about anybody. Those type of receivers, and it's funny you mentioned him because for the longest time, T. Higgins was a popular landing spot in Buffalo before they got Stephon Diggs. And I like T. Higgins, but at 6'4" and sort of the poor pro day numbers that he had, I don't know if he's a good fit in Buffalo. He's not going to create separation. He's a big guy. He's a high point catch guy, but I don't know if that plays to Josh Allen's strengths. It's a lot easier to hit Cole Beasley or John Brown, even though, if they stand on each other's shoulders, they're 4 feet tall, but they're getting open. And I think that's, as you point out, there's something to that as opposed to just being a big receiver, because I think what happened is Megatron came out in 07 and everyone said, okay, we need big receivers, except Megatron ran a 4.35 or whatever he ran. And he was an absolute freak, once in a lifetime top player. So those big receivers, 6'4", 6'5", those guys aren't running 4.3s typically. And even more than that, they're not getting in and out of cuts like you have with the smaller receivers. That's why I love the Stephon Diggs trade so much. And Bean pointed this out. He said at 22, I wasn't sure if the receiver we wanted would be there. So we went out and got one. I have no issue using the first round pick on Stephon Diggs. He's absolutely worth it. And I'm sure that Josh Allen was quite happy to see that too.
We'll talk about running backs pretty heavy as we move along here. And I think that's another interesting discussion because I think a lot of people cling to some old school lines of thinking when it comes to what you need on your roster. Like you look at San Francisco, there was no throwback third down banger type player on that roster. They went with 3 multi-dimensional running backs that all had speed, all had the ability to get outside. Raheem Mostert showed that he could run in between his tackles outside. I don't think that you need to pigeonhole yourself in 2020 in the NFL. You need to get guys that fit your offense. And so I think you make a great point there. But in terms of Brandon Bean, and when he, so much time is spent by him talking about his philosophy in the draft, and that is no matter what, first, second, and third round, I'm going best player available. I built this roster particularly so I can go into a draft and do that. I think the Bills are set up better than most teams to be able to do that. But at 54 now, without a first round pick, could there be any player that's still on the board that's the best player at his position or the second best player on his position when the Bills draft at 54?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it sort of depends on maybe your draft board, I guess. But a guy that's sort of divisive in terms of how people view him is Marlon Davidson, the defensive end out of Auburn. He played alongside Derek Brown. He can play 5 techniques, so he can play outside the tackle. He can kick inside, play a little 3 techniques. So he's versatile, but he's not great at any one thing. And what you're doing there is you're taking a guy with upside to be really good. He's a high motor guy and all those cliches that we like to use. And I think he's going to be a really good player. But is he number 2 on the board? And he's not better than Chase Young, obviously. He's not better than Caleb Chason, but he's versatile. And I actually like him a little more than AJ Epinesa from Iowa, who is bigger than Marlon Davidson. Epinesa is like 6'5", 275, but he didn't test well. And when you watch Epinesa play, he'll flash 2 or 3 plays, and then you won't see anything for 10 plays. Marlon Davidson shows up, and obviously the SEC, he's playing week in and week out, doing well there. So he's a guy that can do a couple things for you, and if you find the right spot for him, and I feel like outside is where he's probably at his best. Maybe you kick him inside, third down pass rush situation, something like that. That's an option. Now, another position, and you sort of hinted at it, running back. You can get the second best running back in middle through the second round, excuse me. But the question becomes, do you want to do that? And this running back class, like the top 5 or 6 guys, are stacked, and they are all fun to watch. And they're probably all going to go in the second round, maybe early third round. But to your point, Matt, Andy Reid has never taken a running back in the first round. And sometimes in these mock drafts, you'll see one going 32 just because it'd be super fun to see DeAndre Swift playing behind that offensive line and with Patrick Mahomes. And I think the only running back he's taken in round 2 was LaShawn McCoy, whose Bills fans are certainly familiar with. So he understands, and we saw it last year with Damian Williams. You can find guys to fit your system that don't have to necessarily be day 1 or day 2 picks. That said, man, if I'm the Bills and I see Jonathan Taylor sitting there, I'm going to think long and hard about it. I love the idea of Jonathan Taylor with Devin Singletary. And again, that makes life easier for Josh Allen. Josh Allen isn't Patrick Mahomes, so maybe Patrick Mahomes doesn't need that running game, but I think the running game helps Josh Allen in terms of making him more accurate, making play action work better, and all those things. You don't have to take a running back in round 2 for the Bills. There might be an edge rusher there that you like, but there are a lot of teams that I would love to see take running backs in round 2, which is a weird thing to say because we're in this anti-running back day and age.
I had some conversations in Indianapolis, that leads me to believe that there's some interest on the Bills and in Cam Akers. So he's a guy that I think if you really like him and you want to potentially maybe jump up in round 3, maybe he's not a target at 54. How high do you have to go, or do you have to get back into the second round if you want Akers? Because it seems like his stock is jumping a little bit.
Yeah, he's a fun guy. So he had some drops last year, but he can catch the ball. And at the end of the day, here's the thing with Cam Akers. He played behind a truly atrocious offensive line, and he did a lot of heavy lifting, and he did it at a high level. He did it consistently. Again, he's a fun guy. So it's DeAndre Swift, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Jonathan Taylor, Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins, and even Zach Moss, who has an injury history out of Utah. So those are all guys you can get. So let's see. So I love the Chargers taking a running back in round 2 just because I think it would be funny to replace Melvin Ingram with Jonathan Taylor, but they pick at 37. That would be funny. The Colts don't need a running back necessarily. The Buccaneers could take a running back in rounds 2 or 3, which I think would help Tom Brady. Their running game hasn't been great. The Steelers might take a running back at 49. The Ravens could take a running back. They have 2 second-round picks, excuse me. The Texans have Dave Johnson, but at the end of the day, do we know what David Johnson is? So maybe they take a running back around 2. So those are just a few of the teams, not even mentioning the Bills. So maybe Cam Akers slips because, the other math we're doing is, all right, does someone want Jacob Eason? Does someone want Jalen Hurts in round 2? Will there be another run on offensive tackles in round 2 after the run in round 1? And then, of course, all these wide receivers are going to keep going off the board. So somebody has to get pushed down. I think there's going to be a run on safeties in round 2 as well. So I don't know if he'll be there at 86, Cam Akers. Zach Moss might be, but again, you're weighing the injury history. And I think one thing we don't take into consideration enough as media and fans is that NFL teams take injuries pretty seriously. Like Terrell Lewis, the edge rusher out of Alabama, had a pretty good season. ACL injury in 2018, elbow injury in 2017, didn't play a lot. Those are concerns. So in terms of Cam Akers at 86, I think you would have to trade up. And then the question is, do you want to part with some picks this year or next year perhaps to get up to probably close to the top of the round in round 3? Bengals, Redskins, Lions. The Lions might want to run. That's another team that might want a running back. All they have is Kerryon Johnson right now. So maybe you're talking about 68, 69, 70. So you're moving up 15, 18 spots. If the Bills want to do it, go for it. I just wonder what the cost is. And I would have no issue doing it to get Cam Akers, though.
Yeah, so you mentioned injuries a minute ago. In the overall view of the draft, how much of a role is that going to play in pushing some prospects in years past that may have gone round 1, round 2, maybe into round 3 or even into day 3, just because of everything going on now with COVID-19, teams not being able to get those medicals, being able to get the information that they necessarily need? Could that push some premier talent down? I know that Brendan Bean has kind of said, round 2, I'm not going to go after some guys with some medical red flags. Round 3, maybe consider it. And then day 3 is when he kind of says that's the kind of where he would kind of chance it as a GM. But what's your take on injuries and how that could play a role in pushing some premier talent down this year?
It's funny, Ryan. We'll find out pretty quickly when Tua gets drafted. We'll see exactly how much the Dolphins or whoever takes him are really concerned about injuries. Tua's an exception, obviously. And, they released all these videos of him running around looking great. I'm not worried about that. I would be worried if they released a video and he's short hopping passes or throwing the ball through the windows of the gym where he's working out, So I think it's good news that he seems to be progressing. But if you're the Dolphins, here's the math I'm doing. So first round picks for wide receivers work out half the time. I think that's the math. You have 3 first rounders at the Dolphins. Let's say they think that Tua is going to work out in terms of being a franchise quarterback. His chances are 33%. You roll the dice. You have 3 first round picks. You have Ryan Fitzpatrick and Josh Rosen, who clearly you're not crazy about. Take him at 5, and whatever happens, happens. You took a risk. Maybe it works out. Maybe it doesn't. Now, the other injuries, those are different stories. I think you're not getting the impact from Terrell Lewis, who I mentioned, for example, who has an injury history because he plays edge rusher. Zach Moss, I mentioned, has had an injury history. He's a running back, and we know that running backs have a 2 or 3 or 4 year life cycle, and then you're moving on to the next one in most cases. So that's a consideration, and I think NFL teams, as you point out, Ryan, are taking that in terms of creating their draft board. I will say this: one of the upsides to not having these 30 visits, and I had a scout tell me this a few weeks ago, is that the scouts do all the work. And at the end of the day, they're the front line of figuring out who's good and who isn't. So they've seen guys for 1 or 2 years. And I had one tell me sometimes what happens when you have these 30 visits and these guys come in, whether it's guys who battle injuries or guys with off-field issues, they come in and charm the coach and the GM and the owner. And that ends up superseding what the scout has been telling them for weeks or maybe months about this player. He ain't a great fit because of some off-field issues or whatever. Maybe he's a great person, but not a great football player. And there have been instances where these guys have been able to sell themselves through basically a 24-hour meet and greet, and maybe that alleviates some of that. And we've heard actually people say that maybe these drafts will be better this year because teams aren't being blinded by someone who may be a great actor, for example. But I agree with Bean. Cautious on day 1 and day 2 with the injuries, because there's no reason to take a guy if he can't play. Day 3, go crazy. You could get a first round talent in day 3 who's fallen because of injuries. And if he works out, wonderful. If you get 2 or 3 years out of him, wonderful. If it doesn't work out, it'll cost you a 5th or 6th round pick. And that was worth rolling the dice.
So we had a question in the chat here, and thank you everybody for jumping on with us live. We always appreciate you. We'll answer a couple of these as we go. With the depth that the Bills have been able to get, do you think they will try to move up knowing that they have a ton of depth in into the first round or even in the second round? My personal opinion on that is that I think because of the draft capital that Bean had to part with to get Stephon Diggs, it's going to be a little too rich for his blood. And that first round pick, to him, you hear him talk about, these picks and the value that he places on them. Every time we talk to him, whether it be before the season, in the season, after the season, it's always comes back to building through the draft. So he's going to be sitting on his hands, and he joked around, he's going to play highlight videos of Stephon Diggs throughout the first round to kind of keep his cool and keep his calm. But I think that if there's a guy that they see in the second round to jump up, it probably makes sense. But because of the depth of some of these positions, I think it probably makes a little bit more sense in the third.
Are we talking wide receiver, Matt?
Anything.
Oh, okay.
To jump up.
Right, just to stay put. Gotcha. Yeah, no, I think that's right because, again, it costs you a lot. Then you still have the second and third round picks, and you can get a lot of good players with those 2 picks, guys that can contribute right away, especially if you're drafting in some of these deep positions. We talked about running back. There'll be edge rushers there if they want to get them guys that can contribute pretty early. So, yeah, I think that's right. I wouldn't trade up because I think Bean probably would have done that math before he got Stephon Diggs. Although I do give him credit for waiting until now to do it because the price apparently was a lot steeper during the season, understandably, if you're the Vikings. So Amari Cooper was 2 first-round picks. So to get Stephon Diggs for 1 first-round pick, it seems like a no-brainer, especially given the maturation that you want to see or continue to see in Josh Allen.
Okay, so another little transition here. So you've put out when we first set up this podcast, you just putting out your 7-round mock, which was a lot of heavy lifting. We all applaud your diligence there. I really like going through it. But you released your second mock draft this week, or your 2-round mock draft this week, and I wanted to dive into that a little bit because you had an edge rusher this time around as opposed to Jonathan Taylor last week. Talk a little bit about him because Zuniga, I think is how you pronounce it. You had the Bills getting him in the 3rd round. Now you have them getting them in the 2nd round.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see how these teams feel about all these edge rushers after we get past Chase Young and Caleb on Chase on. Darrell Taylor out of Tennessee is a guy that people like. Jonathan Grenard, who is Jabari Zuniga's teammate at Florida, is a guy that people like. AJ Epinesa we talked about. Marlon Davis we talked about. So we'll see where they fall. Zuniga's another guy who's battled injuries. So he had a high ankle sprain last year. I think he only played in 5 or 6 games. But when he plays, he flashes. He's strong at the point of attack. He has really good hand usage. I think he ran a 4.68 or something to the combine. So he can move a little bit. He's a good athlete. It's just about keeping him healthy and helping him grow into that position. And he feels like a situational pass rusher in year one, and then you go from there. And if anyone can get the most out of young players, I feel like Sean McDermott's really good at doing that. So day 2 feels like where Zuniga will go, whether it's round 2 or round 3, I'm not certain. But again, and Ryan talked about this, if injuries are a concern for NFL teams, maybe he slips to day 3. Maybe he's a 4th round pick. So it's hard to sort of put your finger on exactly where he may go. But I like the potential he has there based on what he's shown on tape. But again, how's that injury? Is a high ankle sprain something that NFL teams will be worried about? He only played a few games last year, but I like his fit and I like the potential that he brings as a situational pass rush guy in year 1.
Very cool. So Talbot, I want to bounce this off you because, as us who cover the Bills, the scenario here that plays out is a pass rusher as opposed to some offensive weapons that are on the board here. J.K. Dobbins is a name that Bills fans it seems like momentum is starting to develop there. Kyle Duggar, somebody that I know the Bills are high on. And, in that range at 54, some people think it's a little bit too high for what you're going to be asking him to do, but because of what they like, the versatility, what he brings, he could be an option. Leviticus Chennault on the board, T. Higgins. From your perspective, if they were to go edge rusher at that spot, what do you agree with that, or would you like them to go a different direction?
I think an edge rusher makes a lot of sense there when you look at what they currently have. You have Mario Addison, who's been very productive and still is playing at a high level, but he will be 33 years old when this season begins. You have Jerry Hughes on the other side, over 30 years old, I believe 2 years left on the contract. You have Trent Murphy entering the final year of his deal. So they have some young guys on the roster. They have Mike Love. They have Darrell Williams, 7th-round pick, who actually played a decent amount of defensive snaps and on special teams last year. Are either of them the long-term answer in terms of a youth option off the edge? I'm not so sure. So I think edge rusher should be high up there because I also feel like that's something where after round 2, round 3, I think there's a big drop off. So if you can get a guy that you think can be your workhorse of the future and you don't have to really throw him into the fire, so to speak, this year, you can ease him into the lineup with those 3 defensive ends that you currently have. I think an edge rusher makes a lot of sense at 54.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm looking over some more names. Like Curtis Weaver's a guy at Boise State who was crazy productive at Boise State, but athletically, he's not the athlete we've seen from Terrell Lewis, for example, or certainly Chase Young. And scouts question, okay, the competition Boise State was facing, how does that translate to the NFL? He's a guy. Josh Uche out of Michigan is a guy that I actually like a lot. He's undersized, 240-ish. He probably played at. He probably weighs more than that now. Again, situational pass rush guy, quick off the edge. Zach Bond, I don't think he'll be there in late round 2. There's conversations he could go late round 1, early round 2. And then Julian Acquar is another kid out of Notre Dame. His brother plays for the Lions right now. He's raw, but he's extremely strong. He had an injury. He broke his leg, I think, late in the season. He's healthy now. But you're right, Ryan. So after a handful of guys, then you're doing some projecting. Then you have to do a lot of coaching up, and then you have to figure out Alex Highsmith, for example, out of Charlotte, is a smallish school guy, but a lot of upside. But how does that translate, and how quickly does he get on the field? Kyle Duggar at 54 would be interesting. I was actually talking to an NFL guy about him the other day, and the issue isn't the athleticism, because if you saw him at the Senior Bowl, that stood out. And sort of the math you have to do when you watch a kid from a small school is not that he's faster than everyone else, because clearly he's going to be faster than everyone else, but is he quicker off the snap to read what's happening? Is he quicker off the snap to be where he needs to be than everyone else? Because you have to use some tools to translate small school guy D2 and figure out how that works against better competition and ultimately in the NFL. I think it would be not a reach at 54 because athletically he is there, but you have to figure out, okay, How long will it take him to figure out what he needs to do after dominating for 3 or 4 years at the Division II level?
The one appealing thing about a guy like Duger or Jeremy Chin, a guy that the Bills did a FaceTime video with early on, is they promoted a coach internally to big nickel coach. So that's not a normal positional coach that you see on most NFL teams. It kind of makes you think that that's something that they could be utilizing more starting in 2020. They have Saran Neal, a special teams standout, but when he's been on the field on defense, he's kind of held his own as well. But one of those players there, especially with this new role that I think more NFL teams are starting to utilize, I think that's what makes them more appealing at this point, and where you could start to see more teams kind of transition to that big nickel defense is almost more of like a base defense in this day and age.
You mentioned Ryan Wilson. You mentioned Josh Uche and obviously Terrell Lewis, who are both at the Senior Bowl. And I think that one of the real interesting parts of this particular draft is the Senior Bowl is going to carry so much more weight than it has in years past. And I think that, for a guy like Brandon Beane, who already values those 4-year players at the college level, getting a chance to meet with a couple of them, Uche being one of them in Mobile, I think that could be a scenario where there's more comfort there than there will be in other spots. And, obviously I think we heard one of the Mark Dominic, who did his conference call yesterday, the former Bucks GM, he spoke about it yesterday, without those 30 visits, that teams are going to have to go off of a lot of what they saw in Mobile.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, like COVID-19 was a thing when the Senior Bowl and the Super Bowl were going on, but it just wasn't a thing here. And no one was I'm assuming forward thinking enough to say, all right, let's really hunker down on these interviews, although they're pretty thorough as it is. So you had those interviews at Senior Bowl, had those interviews at the Combine, obviously, and it certainly benefited the Lions and the Bengals, who were the coaches of those teams. So we'll see how that translates if the Lions and Bengals take guys from those Senior Bowl practices. Worth noting, Justin Herbert was the quarterback for Zach Taylor and the Bengals. I don't think they're taking Justin Herbert. That would be a huge upset. But there were guys there that I'm sure they'll have their eye on, and seeing those guys up close and personal, and this from being at the Senior Bowl, it's a huge difference than watching them on television. And you can see the ball explode out of Justin Herbert's hand or Jordan Love's hand. You can see Shea Patterson, miss wide receiver after wide receiver in person. I shouldn't be dunking on Shea Patterson. I feel like he didn't have a great Senior Bowl. But you see guys like Chase Claypool, who, showed up 9 pounds heavier at the Combine, but he was there, I think 229 or something in the Senior Bowl, dominating guys. And you can't necessarily see that when you're watching these guys on YouTube or on television. So that's critically important, and maybe even more important. And we don't have access to this, but the interviews, talking to these kids, seeing what they think, see how smart they are football wise and everything else. So to your point, Matt, I think that's a good one and more critical this year than it has been in a long, long time.
Speaking of Chase Claypool, he's another guy that a lot of Bills fans are Notre Dame fans. Ryan is a big Notre Dame fan, so he likes a lot of these Notre Dame guys. But Claypool is interesting because I think he could serve multiple purposes, and position flexibility, is the drum that is banged in Western New York all year long. And so I think you could bring him in, be a complement to Dawson Knox. I know he's a receiver, but could also be in receiver sets put outside. He can be that contested catch, physical presence, and he plays special teams. Do you think 54 is too high? And could you see a scenario where the Bills maybe trade down a few spots and are still able to get him in the second round?
I don't think 54 is too high because, there could be 10 wide receivers that go in the first 2 rounds, which is bonkers. I don't think that's too high. He may be there in the 3rd round. You don't know how teams feel about him. I know a few teams like him as a tight end, which is sort of crazy. I talked to a former GM today, actually, who likes him as a tight end and not a blocking tight end. He's not going to be Gronk, but more in the Evan Ingram mold. And if you're getting that paired with Dawson Knox and the special teams versatility, that feels like, second rounder there. But so I talked to Cole Kmet, the tight end from Notre Dame, and I talked to Troy Pride, the cornerback at the Combine. And both of them seemed surprised that Claypool showed up at 238. We later found out from Brady Quinn, as it turns out, that Claypool had chugged 10 gallons of water on the plane ride, and that's how he gained that weight. I don't know what he weighs now. I don't know what his plan is, but they were both surprised that Claypool would consider a move to tight end, and they didn't, based on how he played at wide receiver, and they didn't see it happening. But if NFL teams feel otherwise, maybe he kicks inside for certain packages, and if nothing else, I don't think he played a lot in the slot. I'm trying to remember at Notre Dame. I think he was mostly outside. But if you're planning on kicking him inside the tight end, he'll have to learn how to play in the slot. And the added bonus of being a special teamer certainly doesn't hurt when you're a rookie or a second-year player.
How would you see Claypool fitting in here in Buffalo? Last year in the playoff game, you had Duke Williams out on the field, and the Bills ended up targeting him more than any other receiver in the game, which was pretty wild because he was inactive for about half the season, and then all of a sudden he played in the finale. They saw enough to say we're going to put him in the playoff game as well. So big-bodied guy just like Duke is, but obviously a lot more athleticism, a lot more talent, personally, in my opinion. So if he was to come in and be the number 4 receiver in this offense, how do you think he would
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea
fit in with Brown and Stephon Diggs?
Yeah, I would love the idea of seeing him in the slot if that's something he would feel comfortable doing. I mean, I would imagine the slot would be a lot easier for him than playing tight end, something he hasn't done. But I think about it this way. So, slot receivers historically feel like smaller guys, but Larry Fitzgerald ain't small. Juju Smith-Schuster ain't small. And those guys are matchup nightmares in the middle of the field. And you add that with John Brown, Cole Beasley, Stephon Diggs, Dawson Knox, and Devin Singletary coming out of the backfield, and possibly J.K. Dobbins or whomever coming out of the backfield. That's a scary proposition. And again, it makes life easier for Josh Allen. It should make his reads easier. He's a huge target chase, Claypool is. He runs a 4.47, I think. He spent the Senior Bowl making contested catch after contested catch. And part of the danger when you say this guy's a great contested catch guy means maybe he's not getting open. But these situations of one-on-one drills, he didn't have the opportunity necessarily to always get open. He can win at the top of his route, no doubt about it. But I think you move him around that offense. I don't know if I'm making him play tight end. I don't know if he's a tight end. He hasn't done that. But I think you move him around and make him like a chess piece and maybe have him run some of the same things that Evan Ingram does, and then put him outside. And, then the special teams aspect that we talked about, I think it's one more playmaker that makes this offense better and makes Josh Allen's job easier. And that seems like, a win for everybody.
That's kind of, you mentioned a chess piece. That's why I kind of like the idea still, even after the Diggs trade, of Leviticus Chennault if he falls to 54, because you're talking about a guy that, a lot of people thought was the number 1 receiver heading into this year, or at least some people did. And so I think, obviously the injury concerns are concerning, but when healthy in this offense, I feel like he would be such an upgrade over Isaiah McKenzie and some of the things you could do in the backfield with him, that the value there at 54 is so high. Is that crazy?
No, but you hit on it, Matt. The issues are the injury concerns. So he ran that 4.59 at the combine. He plays a little faster than that. I think there was some conversation that he might run in the 4.3s, but we hear that about a lot of people. But as soon as he ran that 4.59, he says, "I'm out." And then he had the core muscle surgery, which he needs to do. He needs to get healthy. So again, and Ryan talked about this, how comfortable are Bean and the rest of the staff with taking Chennault in round 2 if his medicals aren't where they want them to be. I've heard people say that he might fall a little further than that. And his versatility is impressive. He does a lot of things. And the counter argument to that is he doesn't do a lot of things necessarily well. Like his route running isn't as crisp as it needs to be. He was basically the only show in town in Colorado. So he had to do a lot of things, ran the shotgun, would often sometimes run the ball out of the backfield, line up at H-back, slot, outside, do all those things. And he's a playmaker. And in a lot of ways, he reminds me of Anquan Bolden in terms of the way he plays the position, because he's 6 feet, maybe 6'1", 220, 230. So what if he runs a 4.55? That's okay. I think more than anything, he has to be healthy. And if Bean and the Bills are comfortable with that, then certainly the second round. But if not, he may fall to round 3.
So we talked a little bit about running back earlier in the show, but I want to revisit it because it is a very hot topic amongst Bills Twitter, because, listen, the Bills filled a lot of holes, and the only thing that they really didn't address is running back. And looking past Devin Singletary, a lot of people see TJ Yeldon and have some concerns, and some of those concerns are valid. I've argued that, if they don't land one of these top backs in the draft, I think you could do a lot worse than TJ Yeldon. I mean, 900 yards, 5 touchdowns, his last year in Jacksonville. He adds a different dimension to the offense than I think Frank Gore brought last year, and I was even banging the table that he should have gotten a little bit more time last year. But you look at the top of this draft and you look at how many running backs could be gone. I think in both your 7 and your 2, you had 2 rounders. You had 3 backs gone by 54. Is there a scenario where all 4, including Clyde Edwards-Helaire, could be gone at 54?
Yeah, so let's go through this. So the Lions, they could take one, and this is assuming that one doesn't sneak into the first round, and maybe one does. I don't think so. Maybe the Dolphins at 26 take a running back. I don't think they do, but Lions have the 35th pick. Maybe they take one. The Chargers at 37, I joke, maybe they take one, and that's not even that big of a joke. And the Buccaneers at 45, you talked about them. So that's 3 right there. Then the Steelers are at 49. So that's 4 right there. If everything goes exactly the wrong way for the Bills. After that, the Eagles ain't taking one at 53, then 54 to the Bills. So will all 4 be there? No. Will one be there by 54? I think there's probably 45, 50% chance that they're all there. I don't know if those are good odds or not, but I think at 54, you'll be able to get Cam Akers, Zach Moss, and maybe one of the other guys slips. So it just depends on which guy that is, whether I don't think it'll be Jonathan Taylor. Maybe it's J.K. Dobbins. So I don't know if that makes Bills fans happy or not. But at 54, 3 of the guys that I mentioned, Zach Moss, Cam Akers, and then maybe J.K. Dobbins is there. So I don't know how that strikes you.
I like it. It's just interesting to, I think that for so many years there were so many holes and just inefficiencies within the organization that fans had so much more to talk about than they have now. But it seems like this is an area where that people really want to see the Bills address, at least in the second or third round running back. But I think there's some value in the 4th round, 5th round. I like what I've seen from AJ Dillon. I know that Marco Louis-Jacques, who I've had on from ESPN, who covers the Bills, he's very high on him as well, and he watches a lot of more college football than I do. What are your thoughts on Dillon?
I love him. He's height, weight, Jerome Bettis, but he's not built like Jerome Bettis. And then he runs a 4.5. He carried people up and down the field last year, and he did it frequently. He's not much in terms of – he doesn't offer a lot in terms of the receiving game. Mm-hmm. That's okay. He got Devin Singletary. But if you just want to punish people – and we saw this at the end of games. This is how the Titans whooped up on the Patriots in that playoff game. This is how the Titans won a lot of their playoff games. They just dragged teams up and down the field because Derrick Henry was doing it for the final 25, 30 minutes. And A.J. Dillon is that type of player. He's not super shifty. But again, when you weigh 250 and you run a 4.5, you're just crushing people, and they don't want to tackle you in the 3rd and 4th quarters. I like him. I like him in the 4th round. I don't think he's going to sneak in round 3 just because of all the other players that are top 100 players. But he had a great career at Boston College, and I feel like he's a guy who can come in right away as a running back and contribute from day one.
Another running back that the Bills have shown some interest in is Darrington Evans from Appalachian State. They had some kind of video conference with him recently, so he's definitely on the radar. I'd like to hear some thoughts on him because I don't think a lot of casual football fans necessarily followed Appalachian State, so they might not know a lot about him.
Yeah, he is the exact opposite end of the spectrum of A.J. Dillon. He's a small, speedy, one-cut-and-go guy, but he is explosive. He is a home run hitter. He's sort of a mini-me version of Devin Singletary. So I don't know how many Devin Singletaries you want on a team. I guess you can never have too many. But if you were looking for a sort of a different flavor of ice cream, maybe A.J. Dillon makes more sense. But Darrington Evans had a wonderful career at App State, great year last year. And that team is a good football team. So don't sleep on the notion that they're not playing anyone. They play big schools, and they do really well against them. They have a linebacker, Keem Davis-Gaither, who is about 220-ish. He was at the Senior Bowl as well. Extremely athletic. We talked about Kyle Duggar, plays mostly safety. I don't know if Kyle Duggar will have to kick inside or move down a linebacker, depending on what they want to do. But Davis-Gaither can do that, and he is a sort of complement to the other side of the ball. And we're talking about Darrington Evans in terms of the type of players they put out. But, I think teams they've known about Evans for a while. The media sort of just coming up on him. He might go in round 3. He might go early day 3, but he's a fun player to watch and a home run hitter.
We're going to be wrapping up here shortly. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us this week. This has been so much fun. One more player specifically I wanted to ask you about, Trayvon Diggs. Obviously, Stephon Diggs' little brother. This is something that's interesting because you there's always the stock up and down reports, as you go through the draft process. But this one jumped out at me, that, headlines that, we could see him going into the 3rd round. You in your 7-round mock draft, you had him going at the end of the 1st round. This last week, you had him slip into the 2nd round. How low could he fall? Why is he falling? And could he be there for the Bills at 54?
I love Trayvon Diggs, and people point to that LSU game as him getting dunked on a bunch of times. He didn't. He played well in that game. Jamar Chase, I think, was the one who scored the first touchdown against him. It was a back shoulder throw at the 1-yard line, and oh, by the way, Joe Burrow threw it. Stephon Diggs was in position to make a play. It was just a great throw and a great catch. The issue is his deep speed. You watch him play. He is strong, physical. He's a playmaker. He's a former wide receiver. His brother, Stephon Diggs. I keep joking that I want the Vikings to draft him at 22 and then make him play wide receiver and wear his brother's jersey, but I don't think that's going to happen. But he's a 1st-round player to me, and I get it. Deep speed maybe is a concern. I've talked to people in the league that say he made a lot of business decisions last year at Alabama. I'm okay with that because we're talking about Terrell Lewis getting hurt because he didn't make business decisions. And, there's a whole conversation we had about paying players and all that, but Trayvon Diggs is healthy. So maybe he slips into round 2 because there's some concerns about the deep speed. There are no concerns about the ball skills or the physicality. He feels like a 49ers cornerback. He feels like a Vikings cornerback, these big, strong, strapping guys. But if you got him in round 2, I would be elated. If he slips to round 3, then something happened that we don't know about. Because it's nothing to do with on-the-field productivity. There are a lot of good cornerbacks in this class. Very few built like Trayvon Diggs who can do what Trayvon Diggs does.
Very good stuff. This was super fun. If you haven't joined us before, we are going to be live every Wednesday night with our Bills Talk podcast. It's a fun way to interact with you guys. We'll have guests on, in some cases, national guests. Ryan Wilson today. Thank you so much for joining me, man. Why don't you let everybody know what's coming from you, where they can find you, anything you can plug.
I had a blast, guys. Thanks so much for having me. We're keeping it real in Central New York, so that's good. Upstate New York. It's Buffalo. Buffalo's not Central New York, right?
Western New York.
Yeah, you guys are Western New York. So I'm representing Central New York. You guys are Western New York. Yeah, so I'm at CBSSports.com. Mostly doing mock drafts, but I write a few times a week about draft prospects and what's going on there. And then CBSSportsHQ.com is the CBS's 24/7 streaming sports network. We're doing a ton of draft coverage, obviously. We'll be covering the draft. Unfortunately, we won't be there in person. No one will, but we'll be doing that start to finish next week as well. So you can check that out. And I guess Twitter is at Ryan Wilson CBS if you're dying to see pictures of my kids doing things on while we're on lockdown that because I have nothing else to do with my time.
Yes, he is a great follow. Make sure you get at him on Twitter. He'll have you covered for the next week. And guys, if you are joining us for the first time, we are now live on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Acast, Spotify. You can find Bills Talk with Matt Parrino. We'll get Ryan's name on there eventually. We're gonna launch it out there. He joked the other day that he's what was the joke, Ryan?
I'm the Richter to your Conan O'Brien, and I don't get that graphic, but I'm there. I'm in the chair next.
Exactly, but he is just as important as I am. And Ryan Talbot, make sure you're following him on Twitter at Ryan Talbot Bills. Ryan Wilson, thanks again for joining us, man. This was a fun time.
Absolutely, anytime, guys.
All right, take care.